All right, so here we are, starting with Chapter 11, which is going to deal primarily with the system of slavery in the South and the cotton economy, or the Cotton Kingdom, as it was often called. Uh, Shorter chapter. It's only going to take it's only going to take kind of 2 videos or 2 days to go through it, but still some important things, some important happenings here that I think are important that we um, spend some time kind of talking about. So. Your packet for Chapter 11 is going to be due on Friday, so make sure you have that emailed to me on Friday. It is available on Moodle, so just so you have that ready for Friday. All right, so let's talk a little bit about plantation life in the South. Now, we've talked about it a while ago. Remember when in the first few chapters in the first unit, how we started to see kind of the lifestyles in one region of the country um, versus another region of the country become something completely separate from one another. The South leads to a more kind of plantation lifestyle, while the North, of course, is more industrial, more city based. Uh, and that just grows over time. Okay, this is a big reason. Again, cause and effect. Right from the start, people start planting cash crops in the South. The plantation culture starts to emerge in the South, while in the North you have cities, you have industry, you have growth in different ways. You have less dependence on slavery. So we already know that the Southern economy is going to be very plantation based and therefore largely intertwined with slavery. In the South, the plantation economy rules. Okay, farming is the industry of the South, and they've established a pretty consistent and effective system down there, right? At least effective for them, and them being the landowners, the people with wealth in the South. Everybody else, as we'll find out in this video and in this chapter, they have their own struggles. Not just slaves, but also the other people in the South that aren't so fortunate to own big, large plantations. Um, the plantation owners in the South control a really significant amount of the wealth that exists in the South. And by controlling the wealth, they control the decision making, they control the politics, they control the economy. So farming is the industry of the South. So much so that they don't feel like they need to branch out into bigger industries, textiles, railroads, things like that. Um, so that's kind of the system that exists down there. We see early on, one thing that we see that over time by the 19th century is that the tobacco economy is really starting to decline in the South. Okay, the problem with tobacco is they're starting to see um, even in the 19th century, you're starting to see more opposition to the use of tobacco products and the dangers that they cause for people. Remember, their number one customer for tobacco products is Europe. Okay, Europeans are starting to turn against tobacco and tobacco use a little bit, which is going to hurt the market for tobacco from the south. The other problem with tobacco is it's very, very difficult to farm. There's only so many regions and places where you can actually grow tobacco, and it's one of the hardest crops on the soil. It's one of the hardest crops on the land. So southern plantation owners are saying to themselves that we have to find an alternative here because the opportunity cost of being part of the tobacco economy really is not necessarily worth it. Something we call opportunity cost. Opportunity cost basically means um, is it is another word of saying is it worthwhile for me to continue to do this, right? Um, Opportunity cost is what am I giving up by continuing to do something else, right? So yes, I will still make money if I continue to grow tobacco, but am I missing out on other opportunities to make money through cotton or something else because um, because I keep doing the tobacco, right? So something else has to come in there to buoy the southern economy. Okay, at first it's short staple cotton. Now there's two types of cotton. There's short staple and there's long staple. So short staple cotton basically is, so if you look at a piece of cotton, which we will on another slide, so a piece of cotton that has these stems on it, and you pick it off of the stems after you once you've grown the cotton. Short staple cotton, the stems on it are much smaller, so it's kind of hard to remove the stems from the cotton ball, so to speak. So it makes the cotton harder to process. Okay, but when so cotton is still, obviously a very viable, still a very viable economic option, but it doesn't really blow up and it doesn't really totally supplant the tobacco economy until we start to cultivate and use what's called large staple cotton. Basically, same concept, but the stems on the cotton are much larger, making it easier to cultivate and easier to pick that cotton. What that leads to is, especially with the use of the cotton gin, is a massive increase in cotton cultivation, where the opportunity cost that people once missed out on with tobacco see that there's lots of money to be made with cotton, okay? Because now clothes are going to be produced by cotton, other things are going to be produced in the textiles by using cotton, replacing wool. That was the primary thing that made clothing and textile products back then. So we see this as a significant change and benefit for people, and especially people in the South now, the plantation owners, who are really going to double down on cotton and start to make a lot of money that way. The other side of that, of course, is that because of the increased cultivation of cotton, we now and don't forget the connection with cotton gin. Because of this now, we see a massive expansion in slavery, okay? Because all of a sudden when cotton cultivation fires up, when the cotton gin is invented, all of a sudden the plantation owners start to buy more land, grow more crops, have more territory, okay? And because they have that, now we see the need for slaves to be doubled down on and increased. So all because of, in part, the cotton gin and the development of long staple cotton, we see the southern economy shift from this tobacco and short staple cotton-based economy to one that's all in on long staple cotton, using the cotton gin, which that's an example of one there, and building up their economy that way. So look at the map. This is at in 1860, so around the start of the Civil War. Okay, so you still have tobacco in some places as a significant crop, but look at cotton, man. Cotton is all over the place. All of this land, there's cotton being grown, lots of money to be made from it. So this is cotton in its heyday, and you also see a little bit of sugar, which is more temperate climates, as well as rice, which was popular. But cotton is definitely the dominant crop. All right. So talk a little bit, and here's an example. This is the cotton before it kind of hatches or whatever, and this is a piece of long staple cotton. Imagine these being much shorter and tighter together, and that ball being a little more smaller in there. Obviously harder to pick, but this would be a long staple piece of cotton right there. All right, so the South is way, way behind the North in terms of industry. Now, we've been talking about this for a while. Shoot me an email to respond to this question. Why is the South so far behind the North in terms of industrial growth? And by industrial growth, I mean no or few railroads, canals, obviously not many factories or textile mills and things. Why is it that the South is so far behind the North in this area? Okay. Now think back to chapter 10 for a second. What are the biggest obstacles to economic development in the South? Okay, there's a few things. Now there's the obvious obstacle to economic development. Um, the political system and the power being controlled in the South by wealthy plantation owners who can see their profits cut into if we start to build railroads and things like that in the South, so they're not going to want it. So that's one obstacle. Okay. But when I ask here, what had the South done? I want you to answer that question for me as well. Thinking back to chapter 10, what was the other thing that had not really happened much in the South that makes it an obstacle for them to develop economically? It has to do with transportation. All right. And again, still reviewing, where is all the money in the South tied up? It's tied up in two areas. It's tied up right here in cotton, primarily, yeah, a little bit in tobacco too, and that sort of thing. It's tied up in cotton, and it's tied up in slavery. And I know you're like, you don't have to pay slaves. That's a really important concept. When an economy is totally dependent on or based on a certain set of circumstances, any change of those circumstances can derail that economy. Okay, so this is a basic economic idea, and I want you to understand why the South is so definitive about slavery here. Okay, it's not because they just hate black people or black people are inferior or anything like that. It's because they're genuinely dependent upon the system of slavery. So take a farmer, for instance. If a farmer ties all of his money or her money up into producing a crop, and then they have a really bad season, and all that crop goes bad, potatoes or corn or whatever, they lose all of their money. Their personal economy is destroyed, right? So take that back to the South and slavery. The South has become dependent. Slave owners in the South, and I'm not making an excuse for them, I don't feel bad for them, but slave owners in the South are dependent upon the institution of slavery. They're dependent upon slave labor. Slave labor, meaning work that workers that don't have to be paid, allows them to plant more cotton, buy more land, expand their plantations even further. Well, what if all of a sudden all those slaves suddenly have to become paid workers? Their economy becomes largely derailed. There has to be cutbacks. Either fire workers, but then who's going to cultivate all the cotton, or maybe I have to sell some of my land and cut back on the cotton that I'm producing, to pay bills or do whatever. But now I'm not able to make as much as I was before. So you got this really difficult and bad circumstance in the South that they're going to have a really hard time making it through. And that, in many ways, is their justification for slavery. All right. So, why do people in the South resent people in the North so much? It's a simple thing, right? Basically, they look with kind of resentment on all the industrial development in the North. And, they develop kind of really a sense of resentment towards people in the North, largely based on the fact that, Southerners think the Northerners look at them essentially as just slave-owning, racist bums, right? The Southern mentality, the Southern ideology, which is something we'll get into here in a little bit, is more along the lines of, you just don't understand the way we live. You don't understand our way of life, okay? And that's where that resentment comes from. Northerners don't understand us. It's a special way of life in the South. And in many ways, it is a special way of life in the South, okay? And I'll talk about that here in a minute. It's also important to note, how many slaves does the average Southern owner, the Southerner, have? The answer, of course, is 0, okay? Many of the slaves are tied up in a few plantations. Okay, so the average Southerner does not own a bunch of slaves. Many Southerners are part of what you call the planter class. Okay, and the planter class are basically people, average everyday people that live in the South that have limited education, that have other jobs, oftentimes working on plantations as well to get by. These people don't have a lot of money. They might have a little farm and some land, but they certainly don't have a whole lot of wealth. I think the common misconception about the slave-owning South is that everybody that worked the plantation was a slave. Well, that's not true. You need foremen to oversee the slaves, and they work they do. You have regular everyday Southerners, like members of the planter class, who work in the fields alongside slaves to make money to help take care of their families. Okay, these people have limited education and limited opportunity. But here's the irony: they're dependent upon Southerners for their way of life. They're dependent on Southerners for their money and their circumstances. So slavery to them is also, even though it doesn't, no slaves might be good for them, they also don't want to see slavery end, because if it does, all of a sudden they might find themselves out of a job. The planter class very much worries about that, because so there's no such thing as minimum wage back then. So, say slavery ends, the plantation owners are going to fire all the planter class folks and hire all the former slaves and pay them crappy wages and have them do the work that these other guys did. So the planter class, they're very much dependent on the plantation. Make sure you understand that. The planter class people, very dependent upon the plantation. Okay? Just a little bit more here and then we'll be done. I want to talk a little bit about culture and society in the South. Now, I just mentioned before how a lot of the resentment that exists amongst Southerners for Northerners is just this idea that they don't understand the lifestyle and the way of life that the typical Southerner has. Okay, there are certain aspects of Southern society that are neat. I know we talked a while ago, maybe chapter 3, about the concept of the debutante and the debutante ball. In the South, women are very proper in many ways. They dress particularly, they dress very nice. They look very nice. They act and behave in a very proper way. Now, of course, it reinforces the concept of female subordinates. Now, we've always been talking about this cult of domesticity and Republican motherhood and all these other concepts, how they exist in the North primarily. We haven't talked about it much in the South. While women in the South are a little bit different, their type of subordinates is very different. Women aren't as educated in the South. Therefore, the concept of this Republican motherhood ideology isn't something that's as much a big deal in the South. However, they do play into the concept of women being very needy. Women in the South are more needy than in other areas. They need to be very protected by men, and men are very protective of their women, whether it be their wives, daughters, mothers, sisters, whatever. To the men in the South, the Southern gentlemen, so to speak, honor is something that's very important. Okay, Southern men are truthful. Okay, they're honest, respectable, honest and respectable, even to the point of conflict. They're going to tell you the truth whether you want to hear it or not. This is maybe, Andrew Jackson was a Southerner, and he had kind of this honor sense about him as well. Maybe he went a little bit too far sometimes with it, but he's going to tell you the truth, at least that he sees it, whether you want to hear it or not. And this was the credo and the ideology of the Southern gentleman. But these men were so about their honor that it would often result in conflict. And this is why duels and things like that happen much more frequently in the South. Okay? In terms of education, people in the South, and even to today, people in the South are much less educated, much less literate. Really, unless you're considered to be, unless you're very wealthy, unless you're living in a big plantation home like this, you really have limited opportunity for education, right? You're going to work the fields. You're going to be a farmer. You're going to be a member of the planter class. Unless you're part of a wealthy family, then maybe you go to college and take advantage of that opportunity. Okay? What this does in the South is make the gaps bigger between the regular everyday people and the poor, plain folk, everyday people. Okay? The lack of educational opportunities in the South further kind of widen that gap, that you really have even more more distinct class system in the South. Okay? And at the very bottom are these people called hill people. These are the poorest of the poor. Okay? The conditions that hill people lived in would probably be considered worse than slavery. Hill people did not like lifestyle in the South, did not like the control that people that the plantations kind of had over life. In fact, many hill people actually were against secession from the Union and actually fought for the North during the Civil War. Okay, these people tended to be from different regions. You do get some in the deep South, particularly Florida, which is one of the poorest states, but also kind of some northern wedges of the country as well, of the South as well, more northern parts of the South, if that makes any sense. These hill people, as bad as their conditions were, they didn't want secession and they don't want slavery to end, because no matter, and this is an important thing to think about, no matter how bad their circumstances were, at least they weren't slaves, and they were willing to accept those difficult lifestyle circumstances just because, they were a little bit better off than the slaves were. Okay, all in all, folks in the South are incredibly dependent upon the plantation, and this is going to make it very difficult come the Civil War for people to, break away from the Southern ideology. The plantation is our way of life. The plantation runs cities and runs communities, and leaders within these communities, are usually the plantation owners, and they provide for the economy. They provide jobs. They provide for the middleman, right? If I run a ferry river service, or I move cotton from one place to another, I depend on the plantation to bring me a supply so I could take it to New Orleans, or take it to Charleston, or take it to the rivers to go wherever it has to go. Everything is centered around this system. So it's going to be very hard to break away from it at the end of the day. All right, so that is all for today. We'll finish up tomorrow, and that's it. See you.